It started with silence. Not the silence of a room gone quiet or the hush before a storm, but something deeper. Something that pressed into the bones of the world and made the birds forget how to sing. Something that stopped satellites in mid-transmission. Something that crawled beneath skin and made people across the globe stop whatever they were doing and just listen. No sound. No static. No explanation. Only the feeling that something ancient had just opened its eyes and was looking right at us. The first signal came through a deep space monitoring station in northern Canada, an obscure facility meant to track comet fragments and leftover orbital junk. It was nothing special, not by government standards. But what they received wasn't junk. It wasn't a comet. It was a message, structured, rhythmic, impossibly precise. So clear it made Morse code seem like cave scribbles. The technicians didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a prank, a hoax. But deep down, no one really believed that. Within hours, the signal repeated. Then again. And again. And it wasn't just in Canada. Antennas in Australia picked it up. So did a military array buried in the sands of Nevada. And the observatories in Chile. The sequence never changed. Same cadence, same pattern. Like a heartbeat tapping through the fabric of the void. The world governments tried to hide it. That lasted 12 hours. Then someone leaked it, just a fragment. Enough for the world to panic. But panic faded into something else when the full translation came through. Asterisk, we are the apex. We have chosen your species. Asterisk. At first, people didn't know what that meant. Apex of what? Chosen for what? The internet spiraled as it always did. Theories exploded. News anchors fought to remain calm while speculation chewed at their composure. Religions split in half overnight. Some celebrated. Others feared annihilation. But behind closed doors, the real questions were being asked. What do they want? And why now? In a secured facility beneath the Alps, the United Earth delegation assembled for what they called the contact protocol. No uniforms. No flags. Just humans. Scientists, diplomats, engineers, anyone they thought might understand what was coming. They gathered around a single screen that showed the message in real time as it shifted and expanded. Asterisk, we watched. We waited. Your species has heart. Fire. Madness. Love. You do not break. You rise. For this we choose you. Asterisk. The silence in that room could have collapsed stars. No demands. No warships. No threats. Just a declaration. They had chosen us. For something. And they were coming. The following weeks blurred into chaos. Every nation entered lockdown. Space was monitored like never before. Military installations operated in near-dark secrecy. Civilians were told nothing, though some figured out more than they were supposed to. Those who remembered the first broadcasts walked around with a look in their eyes, like something was waiting just behind the sky. When the apex finally arrived, no one saw them land. They weren't ships in the traditional sense. More like wounds in the sky that healed themselves when no one was looking. No propulsion. No noise. Just sudden presence. They did not touch down in cities or hover over landmarks. They appeared in places untouched by human footprints, high mountains, deep forests, the ocean floor. And then, they sent their children. Not as prisoners. Not as spies. But as infants. Wrapped in impossible materials. Carried by machines shaped like thoughts. Left gently, carefully, in places where humans would find them. The first was discovered in the ruins of an abandoned research base in Antarctica. No footprints. No sign of entry. Just a child, not human but not entirely alien either. Eyes too large. Limbs too delicate. Skin like pearl beneath frost. But it cried. It breathed. And it reached out when the researcher touched it. The second appeared on a Tibetan mountainside. The third in a Siberian cave. The fourth deep within the Amazon, lying peacefully beside a jaguar that refused to leave its side. Each time the message was the same. Asterisk, raise them. Teach them. Let them know who you are. Asterisk. That was the moment the world broke in two. Some refused. Called it a trick. A trap. A violation. Others accepted. They stepped forward, shaking and afraid but willing. They took the children in not as experiments, but as something else. Something new. It wasn't easy. The apex children did not behave like human children. They grew fast, then slowed, then fast again. They spoke without words. They dreamed into people's minds. Sometimes they vanished in the night only to return with knowledge of things no human had ever seen. But what shocked the world most was how human they began to seem. They laughed. They cried when others cried. They touched the faces of the people who raised them and whispered thoughts into their heads that made old soldiers weep and small-town teachers forget what loneliness felt like. The media wasn't allowed to show them. But leaked images spread like wildfire. Grainy photos of glowing eyes. Of small hands holding weathered fingers. Of smiles that weren't quite human but weren't wrong either. The children called their caretakers guides. And every time one of them spoke, truly spoke, the words carried weight. Asterisk, you burn. But you love. You destroy. But you create. That is why we chose you. Asterisk. Still, not everyone was convinced. There were attacks. Fear-driven mobs. People who thought the Apex had sent demons or weapons. A few children were taken. Some vanished forever. One was found floating above a burned compound, eyes closed, whispering the names of the dead. The Apex said nothing. Not once did they respond to the violence. Not once did they interfere. But their presence lingered, always just out of reach. And those who tried to touch the places they landed reported strange sensations. Time moving sideways. Thoughts not their own. Visions of stars dying and being reborn. Some humans tried to reach out. Rockets were launched, messages sent. No reply. Only the children remained. Years passed. Some of the Apex children reached the age of what would be 10 or 11 by human standards, though none could measure them accurately. They seemed to grow not with time but with experience. The guides became families. Governments softened. Protocols evolved. Schools were built, not for teaching the children but for learning from them. The world changed slowly, unevenly. But one thing never changed. The question, why us? And then something did change. In a small coastal village, so small it barely had a name, one of the oldest Apex children began to speak in her sleep. She cried out names no one had ever heard. She whispered in languages not spoken anywhere on Earth. Her guide, a quiet woman with eyes like dusk, recorded every word. The next morning the child wouldn't wake. She breathed. She lived. But she didn't respond. Like her mind had gone somewhere else. Then another child followed. Then another. 10 in total. Each of them older. Each of them more connected to their human families than to whatever they came from. And all of them, silent. The Apex sent no warning. No message. But a pulse rippled through space, readable only by deep-range observatories. A wave, subtle but sharp, like the beating of a distant heart growing restless. The scientists feared the worst. The diplomats braced for contact. But the guides, those who had raised the children, they weren't afraid. They were grieving. Because they understood something the governments hadn't seen. The children were leaving. Not physically but spiritually, emotionally. They were pulling away, closing off as if they had been hurt. Or worse, abandoned. One of the guides tried to reach out, to her child, the one who had called her mother even when it didn't quite understand the word. She begged it to speak again. To return. And just before the silence took hold completely, the child opened its eyes and whispered one final thought. Asterisk, you showed us beauty. But you have not yet shown us truth. Asterisk. Then it was gone. Not dead. Not absent. Just unreachable. That night, across the planet, every Apex landing site began to glow. Softly at first like moonlight filtering through clouds. Then brighter. Pulsing. And then, they began to open. Not like before. This time there was sound. A low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through oceans, through mountains, through bone. The world paused. And in that pause a voice returned. But it wasn't from the Apex. It came from one of the children. A boy raised in a desert community, known for his laughter and his love of rain. He stood beneath the stars, eyes silver with tears, and spoke to a crowd that hadn't even realized it was listening. Asterisk, they chose you not because you were perfect. Not because you were wise. They chose you because you are broken, but you try. Because you fall, but you fight to rise. Because you destroy, but you ache for peace. Asterisk. Asterisk, but now they ask one final thing. Asterisk. Asterisk, show us who you really are. Not your speeches. Not your machines. Not your dreams. Asterisk. Show us your truth. Then the glow faded. The boy collapsed. And a single phrase appeared across every screen in every language across the earth. Judgment begins. No one knows what that means. Not yet. But the silence is back. And this time it's not just watching. It's waiting. For days no one spoke of anything else. Cities that never slept slowed down. The world turned quieter, not silent like before but thoughtful, heavy. That last message, asterisk, judgment begins, asterisk. It hit different. It didn't sound like a threat, not really. But it felt like one. Or worse, it felt like disappointment. The boy who had spoken those words remained unconscious, resting in a medical center guarded by more soldiers than most embassies. Monitors tracked every heartbeat, every flicker behind his closed eyes. Scientists studied him like he held the key to everything. But none of their scans told them what they really needed to know. Where were the rest of the children? Why had they gone quiet? What did truth mean to the apex? The boy's name, at least the one given to him by his guide, was Alien. He'd once said it meant nothing in his original tongue but liked how it sounded when humans said it. His guide, a weathered man who used to teach poetry before all this started, refused to leave his side. He barely spoke, only watched over Alien with a kind of quiet ache in his face, like someone watching a fire burn through a house he could no longer save. Outside that room, leaders fought behind closed doors. What was judgment supposed to look like? Were the apex coming back to test us? Or had we already failed? Some feared war, but no one had ever seen the apex lift a weapon. Some thought it was a spiritual reckoning. Others thought it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe the children were simply evolving, moving on like caterpillars to something beyond human understanding. But deep down most people felt it. We were being weighed, measured. And maybe, just maybe, we weren't enough. That idea sat in people's chests like ice. Across the world, strange things started happening. In the city of Lagos, a girl who'd grown up with an apex child named Lyra began drawing symbols in her sleep. She'd never been able to draw before, not like this. She sketched pages of unfamiliar star maps, strange patterns that matched no known constellations. Her parents tried hiding the drawings, afraid of what attention it might bring, but a neighbor caught sight and sent them to the press. Within hours, astrophysicists across the world were arguing on live broadcasts about what it meant. In the deserts of Arizona, an old man wandered out of a hospice care center and walked 40 miles before collapsing beside a dried-up creek. He hadn't spoken in 2 years. When rescue teams found him, the only thing he said was, "They're listening through the dust." In Shanghai, a power grid failed for 7 seconds. In those 7 seconds, every camera picked up a flash of something hovering above the skyline. It vanished before anyone could confirm what it was. But footage spread. People compared it to the original landing events. Others said it looked more like a warning. None of these events made sense on their own. But together they created a pulse, a rhythm of something building, creeping beneath the surface. Like the world was getting ready for something it couldn't see yet. Some blamed the children. But they weren't children anymore. The oldest of them, those who had been raised by humans for more than a decade, had grown taller, more poised. They rarely spoke aloud. Their skin shimmered faintly in moonlight. They moved with a grace that felt practiced, rehearsed, as if they'd seen the ending already and were only waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Some still stayed with their guides. Others wandered. A few disappeared entirely. But none of them answered the question that burned behind every human interaction now. What truth are we supposed to show? Alien remained still. His dreams, however, weren't empty. A neurologist stationed at the research site in Norway noticed patterns in his brain activity, waves that matched musical structures. Not random, not chaotic, but almost mournful. She recorded it, played it on a synthesizer. The sound made a janitor weep without knowing why. It was music, yes, but it felt like a goodbye. The neurologist tried something desperate. She played music back to him. Human songs. Ancient lullabies. A recording of ocean waves. Static from old radios. A clip of a child laughing. No change. But when she whispered a poem, one that Alien's guide had written long ago, his fingers twitched. The scientists dismissed it as involuntary. But the guide? He knew better. Back in the Tibetan highlands, another child, Asha, woke suddenly from her sleep. She sat up, whispered Alien's name and collapsed again. Her guide, a midwife who'd once said Asha brought warmth into every room, noticed something in her hands, tiny crystals like frozen raindrops. She'd never held them before. They hadn't been there when she went to bed. And when tested, the crystals didn't match any known composition. More questions. No answers. Governments began forming quiet teams, calling them witness circles, made up of guides, researchers, and people who'd had direct contact with the apex children. Not soldiers. Not politicians. Just humans. People who'd felt the changes firsthand. People who might understand what truth looked like to beings older than galaxies. One such circle gathered at an old monastery converted into a research retreat. There were 15 of them, each from different corners of the planet. They didn't wear badges. They didn't hold titles. But they carried something heavier: memories, connections, pain. The first to speak was an old woman who'd raised one of the youngest apex children, A boy who used to trace clouds with his fingers and hum tunes she never recognized. She said he stopped humming the day the message came. He hadn't cried. He hadn't smiled. He just walked into the hills and never came back. The next speaker, a man with burn scars on his hands, said his child used to ask him questions that made him feel both wiser and more foolish than he'd ever been. She'd once asked, "Why do humans hide love behind rules?" He never had a good answer. Now he wished he did. Others spoke of silence, of dreams, of growing distance. One woman, eyes hollow from weeks of no sleep, said her apex daughter had looked at her before vanishing and simply said, "You don't see yourself clearly yet." She couldn't stop replaying that sentence. The apex hadn't invaded. They hadn't destroyed. They just asked something of us, to show them who we really are. But what did that mean? The world kept turning. People tried to go on with their lives. Or sleep. Laugh when they could. But the tension never left. Every conversation circled back to the children, the messages, the silent judgment waiting in the stars. New groups emerged. Some called themselves truth-bearers, believing they needed to show only the best of humanity to win whatever test the apex had set. Others, more skeptical, called for transparency, believing we needed to expose everything, even the ugly parts, to prove honesty. Then there were the deniers who believed none of it mattered. That the apex were gone. That it had all been a cosmic trick and the world was wasting itself chasing shadows. But the truth? No one knew what was coming. A few began to return to the places the children had been found years ago, hoping for signs, symbols, anything. Some claimed the landing sites now pulsed faintly under the earth, like buried hearts. Others heard whispers in dreams when they stood too long near those grounds. One man camped beside the Antarctic site where the first child was found. After 3 nights without sleep, he claimed he saw stars rearranging themselves. Not shifting, but folding like a message written in constellations. He came back shaking. Said nothing except, "We're not alone in our watching." That phrase caught on. Not alone in our watching. Because maybe the apex weren't just testing us. Maybe they were watching each other too. Maybe they'd taken a risk choosing humans. And now they were waiting to see if it was worth it. The boy, Elian, finally moved again. Just once. He opened his eyes for half a second, stared directly at his guide, and whispered something no one could translate. Sounded like a question. Then he went still again. But that word, recorded by trembling hands, was analyzed, repeated, dissected. It didn't match any apex dialect ever heard. But it did match one thing. An ancient human word, long forgotten, buried in a tribal language almost erased by time. The word, burden. That was all he said. Burden. And suddenly it all felt different. Were we being judged, or were we being asked to carry something? Was this about proving our worth, or being offered a choice? People started revisiting everything. The dreams. The messages. The way the children had looked at their guides, not like subjects to be tested but like someone looking for a home. What if this wasn't a trial? What if it was a plea? The apex had called themselves the pinnacle of evolution. Apex. The top. But maybe that wasn't pride. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe they didn't want perfection. Maybe they wanted someone to take what they no longer could carry. Not power, but hope. The idea spread quietly at first. Through forums, podcasts, underground discussion groups. But it grew. And the witness circles began asking a new question. Not how do we pass their test, but what if they're asking us to help them? That's when things began to shift. Not globally. Not overnight. But in quiet places. A father built a swing in his backyard again, even though his daughter was gone. A young teacher began reading the poems of her former apex student aloud, sharing them with strangers. An ex-soldier burned his uniform and started planting trees where nothing had grown before. Small things. Human things. No one knew if it was the answer. But it was something. Something real. The apex children still hadn't returned. The message still echoed. Judgment begins. But now maybe we were starting to understand. This wasn't about what they thought of us. It was about what we saw when we looked at ourselves. And if we didn't like that reflection, we still had time to change it. Maybe. But time was running out. And the stars were still watching. It started with the sky turning the wrong shade of blue. Not everywhere, just in certain places. Over remote forests, distant oceans, and one crowded city center where hundreds of people stood and pointed upward at once, not knowing why. The shift lasted seconds. Then everything returned to normal. But it wasn't normal. Not anymore. Something had changed. Not just in the sky. In the air. In people. You could feel it in your bones, in the way silence now had weight. The kind that pressed on your chest and didn't let go. The kind that made every breath feel like it had to count for something. The old landing sites, the ones the children had first arrived at years ago, began humming faintly. The vibrations couldn't be heard, but they were felt. People who stood too close reported ringing in their ears, flashes of memories that weren't their own, or sudden tears with no cause. Then came the lights. High above Earth, beyond any orbit humans had ever touched, flickers began to appear. Soft, white, pulsing. Some thought it was just cosmic noise. But others, especially those who had once raised the apex children, knew better. It wasn't noise. It was a signal. And it was getting louder. The witness circles gathered again, this time in the mountain vault beneath the northern ridge, where the first human apex communication logs had been stored. Not because they had answers, but because they were running out of time. Everyone could feel it now, deep in the body, like a storm gathering behind the eyes. Elian still hadn't spoken again. But his heartbeat, once steady, now followed a strange rhythm, matching the pulse in the sky. A young researcher noticed it first. She hadn't slept in 3 days, surviving on black coffee and instinct, but when she aligned the signal's pulse with Elian's biometric rhythm, the pattern locked in perfectly. It wasn't just coincidence. He was connected to whatever was coming. And he wasn't alone. In small towns, isolated farms, crowded shelters, other apex children who had once gone missing began to reappear. Quietly. Not with drama or spectacle. They walked in barefoot, stared into the faces of their old guides, and sat down without saying a word. One sat in the ruins of a collapsed school in Brazil, holding a piece of chalk and drawing symbols that glowed faintly on the crumbling walls. Another stood at the edge of the sea in Tokyo, arms outstretched, facing something no one else could see. And one, just one, walked into the middle of a UN emergency summit in Geneva, placed a stone on the table and whispered, "Asterisk, we didn't choose wrong. But you have to see yourselves now." Asterisk. Then she vanished. No cameras caught where she went. No doors opened. She was simply gone. The stone she left behind didn't match any earthly material. Inside it was a swirl of light and shadow, moving constantly, like memory frozen in motion. It showed images. Not of the apex. Of humans. Moments of kindness. Moments of cruelty. Acts of courage. Of fear. Of selfishness. Of sacrifice. It was everything. Everything we are. No filters. No edits. Just truth. The stone didn't judge. It didn't speak. It just showed. And everyone who looked at it walked away a little heavier. Then came the silence. Not a peaceful one. An eerie one. A stillness across the globe that didn't feel natural. Birds stopped singing in some places. Dogs stopped barking. Even the wind held its breath. Satellites went offline for 3 minutes. During that blackout, every child born of the apex, those who had lived quietly among us, stood up and began walking. All at once. Toward the original landing sites. From every continent. Some walked across highways. Some climbed mountains. Others crossed rivers with nothing but the clothes on their backs. People tried stopping them, asking questions, pleading. None of them spoke. None of them stopped. It was like watching a tide pull away from the shore, knowing something massive was about to return. The guides followed. Not all but many. Because they felt it too, that whatever this was, it was the moment. The pivot point. The thing they had been unknowingly preparing for. Those who didn't follow were left in their cities and towns, watching skies that no longer looked like the ones they grew up under. News anchors spoke in whispers. Power grids flickered again. Hospitals reported newborns blinking in unison, as if recognizing a sound no one else could hear. And high above it all, the lights in the sky rearranged. They formed a shape. A ring. Not like a ship. Not like a weapon. Like a doorway. The meaning was clear. Someone was coming through. Or maybe, something was trying to come out. People panicked. Governments prepared every defense they had. But the witness circles urged calm. They said this wasn't about war. This was about reflection. And choice. The original landing site in the Arctic, the one from the very first contact, began cracking. Not breaking apart violently. Just splitting like something beneath it was unfolding after centuries of sleep. Elian opened his eyes again. He didn't move. Didn't speak. He just cried. One tear. Then another. His guide reached for his hand, whispering that he was here. That everything would be all right. Elian finally looked at him. And he said, "I didn't want you to see us this way. But you had to. So you choose differently." Then he closed his eyes again. The message, unclear as it was, struck something deep. Something ancient. A wound humans had carried for far too long. The belief that we always had to fight, to prove, to dominate. But now we were being offered something else. Responsibility. And the cost of failing wasn't extinction. It was irrelevance. The apex weren't gods. They were tired. Exhausted from being the only ones holding the line. And now they wanted to give it up. Not because they couldn't go on, but because they believed we could. If we were willing to look in the mirror, and not look away. The ring in the sky opened wider. The lights pulsed faster. The children stood in circles around each site, humming the same haunting tone, barely audible to human ears, but enough to rattle your soul. A choice was coming. Not forced. Not demanded. Offered. One that could change everything about who we were and what we would become. But we still didn't know what came next. Or what we'd have to give up to become what they believed we could be. The sky cracked. The hum grew louder. The world waited, hearts pounding in unison. And just before the ring lit up completely, everything stopped. Time held its breath. And we stood, every one of us, on the edge of something vast and unknown. Something that might save us. Or undo us. And we had to decide. Who are we when someone finally believes in us more than we do ourselves? The answer would come. But not yet. The world stood frozen, breathless, waiting for the ring in the sky to open all the way. But instead, it closed. Not slowly. Not gently. It slammed shut with a blinding flicker that echoed without sound across the sky. Then darkness. Not night. Not a blackout. A kind of stillness so deep it made cities feel like tombs. The apex children all dropped to their knees at once, as if a string had been cut. People rushed to them, panicked, shouting, desperate to understand. But the children didn't respond. Their eyes were open, staring at something no one else could see, their mouths just slightly parted like they were listening. One of the children in Morocco whispered something barely audible. Not a warning. A question. Why didn't they stay? No one knew what to say. Not the scientists watching from behind thick glass walls. Not the military officers still trying to calculate the threat level. Not the guides whose hearts were cracking open as the children they raised fell into silence again. They had come so far. Given everything. And now it felt like the world had failed a test it never even knew it was taking. For a few hours nothing happened. The news stopped running live reports. The sky returned to its usual shade. The lights vanished from orbit. Humanity held its breath, unsure if that had been the end, or just the beginning. Then the first dream hit. It came without warning. A surge of images, memories, voices that didn't belong to the people having them. One man in a crowded hospital collapsed to his knees, weeping uncontrollably, describing the death of a star in a galaxy no human had ever seen. A woman in a subway station screamed and clutched her chest, convinced she'd just watched an entire planet die of loneliness. And across the world, thousands more began to feel things they couldn't explain. Sorrow that wasn't theirs. Hope that wasn't earned. Entire lifetimes of someone, or something, else. The apex weren't gone. They had poured themselves into us. Not as an invasion. As a final attempt to connect. The truth broke slowly, piece by piece, like glass under pressure. The guides were the first to notice that some of their thoughts no longer felt private. Not because someone was spying. But because they could feel others there, ghosts of minds older than history, sitting quietly in the corners of their consciousness, waiting. Not controlling. Just watching. As if to say, now let's see what you do. People started dreaming in languages that didn't exist. A child in Sudan drew a star map on the wall of a refugee camp with ash and water. One that matched a stellar formation not yet visible from Earth for another century. A farmer in Canada built a sculpture from scrap metal that, when scanned, projected a mathematical proof solving an energy problem no human team had cracked. All across the world the signs piled up. The apex hadn't chosen to raise us just for diplomacy or survival. They were preparing to become us. Not physically, but something deeper. Integration. And maybe a replacement. The cost of that gift, the truth of it, hit harder than anyone expected. We weren't just raising children of another species. We were becoming the medium for a legacy billions of years old. A living bridge. And some people hated that. A growing movement rose quietly at first but fast. They called themselves the Severance. They believed the apex were trying to override human identity. That these dreams, this knowledge, this alien empathy, was a soft kind of conquest. That if we didn't cut ties now, humanity would forget who it was. They weren't fringe. They were scientists, soldiers, teachers, parents. They loved their species deeply. And fear twisted that love into something sharp. The first major conflict didn't start with weapons. It started with fear. Someone sabotaged one of the Arctic transmitters that had once communicated with the Apex ships. No one was hurt, but the signal pattern changed after that. Became unstable. People started collapsing in waves, their minds suddenly flooded with too much memory, too many lives, too many voices. The guides rushed to help, but they too were starting to feel overwhelmed. They had spent years helping the Apex children learn what it meant to be human. Now they were struggling to remember what that meant themselves. Elian began speaking again. Not often. But when he did, the words chilled people to the bone. They're not coming back unless you let go of the idea of being first. What do you mean? His guide asked him one night, holding his hand through trembling fingers. Elian blinked slowly. We weren't the first either. We had to give up pride to survive. Now it's your turn. That was when the second pulse came. Not a light. A sound. Not everyone heard it. Only those who had touched the Apex children deeply, emotionally, who had bonded through sleepless nights, through whispered fears, through the raw, fragile work of raising something not quite human, yet more human than we were ready for. They heard music. Sad low like a lullaby meant for dying stars. And a message that burned itself into their minds like a brand. This is your last chance to walk forward. And then, a question if your children became something more than you, would you fear them? Or follow them? Every city that had once housed an Apex child began to feel pressure underground. Tunnels cracking. Power grids destabilizing. Old relics, those the children had drawn with when they were young, began to react again. Soft glows. Low hums. Patterns repeating on walls, in water, and sound waves. It wasn't chaos. It was a signal. The Apex weren't leaving us behind. They were calling us forward. But they couldn't carry us. We had to choose. The Severance moved to shut everything down. Temporarily, they said. Just long enough to give the world time to breathe. But those closest to the children, those who still remembered what it felt like to be seen without judgment, knew that time was exactly what we didn't have. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't waiting. It never was. And now the ones who had learned to dream in Apex were starting to remember something buried even deeper. Something no one had told them. Something even the Apex had kept hidden. A memory that belonged not to them, but to something older than them. Something they had run from. And now maybe it had followed them. Through us. The ring in the sky didn't close out of fear. It closed because we weren't alone in being watched. And if we failed to rise, someone else would come. Not to raise us, but to erase what they saw as a failed inheritance. The dream fragments began to carry warnings. Not in words. In grief. In entire galaxies reduced to ash. In voices silenced not by war, but by disappointment. And now humanity stood trembling at the edge of two choices. Live small. Or risk becoming something greater. Even if that meant shedding parts of ourselves we once thought sacred. No one knew what would happen next. But somewhere deep in the earth, a second ring had begun to hum. Not in orbit. Not in sky. But below. Waiting to open. From the inside. The ground beneath the old mountain range shook for the first time in centuries. Not violently. Not like an earthquake. It was slower than that. Deeper. Like something long asleep was shifting its weight, rising after an endless dream. And all across the globe, people stopped what they were doing, not because of sirens or alerts but because they felt it in their bones. A second ring was waking up. Not in the sky. Not above. Below. The hum started soft. A low vibration that made glass tremble and power lines flicker. No one said the word at first, but they all thought it. Another one is coming. And maybe this one wasn't ours. The witness circles gathered for the last time. No more debate. No more charts. They sat in silence around a single table, staring at each other like people about to step off a cliff together. The air carried that same heavy silence. The kind you get when a storm's on the edge of breaking, and everyone's too afraid to speak first. They had read the signals. They had seen what the children were becoming. And they knew something larger was at play, something even the Apex had feared. The guides were already preparing. Some had packed bags. Others carried nothing at all. They just stood beside the children, now no longer small, no longer fragile. They had grown into something else. Taller. Brighter. Not in body, but in presence. As if the gravity around them had changed. Elian stood in the middle of the Arctic Circle, where the snow had melted in a perfect ring around him. His guide stood nearby, heart pounding, unable to speak. Not out of fear. Out of awe. Elian's voice was calm, but it didn't sound like a child anymore. It's coming from beneath. It's not them. It's the ones they ran from. His guide stepped closer. And what do they want? Elian turned, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness that felt older than Earth itself. They want to finish what was started long before us. The second ring cracked open. It wasn't metal. Or stone. It was something different. Like folded space uncoiling. A hole that wasn't empty, but dense with pressure and memory. A pulse shot upward from the opening, invisible to the eye but heavy enough to knock birds from the sky and cause every screen on Earth to go black for 6 full seconds. When they came back on, every screen displayed a single image. An ancient civilization. Burnt. Empty. Not human. Not apex. Something else. Something that had ended itself by trying to contain what couldn't be shaped. A species that reached too far and lost itself trying to control what was meant to grow. The message was clear. This is your reflection if you turn back now. The apex children, still kneeling around the earth, rose. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. And they began to walk. Together. Toward the second ring. The guides followed. Not with orders. Not with fear. With trust. But at the last moment, just before they reached the edge, Elian stopped. He turned to his guide, his voice shaking now. Not with fear. With something heavier. They didn't tell us everything. His guide frowned. What do you mean? Elian looked toward the ring, where the pulse was stronger now, pulling the air inward like a breath before a scream. There's another child. What? One they left behind, hidden. Because they were afraid of what she'd become. The words didn't make sense at first. But the guide felt the truth of it in his chest. It wasn't just another apex. It was something in between. Half human. Half apex. Something they had hidden from both sides. Someone raised in secret. Not as a bridge, but as a lock. And now the lock was breaking. The ground split wide, revealing not another child, but a shape. Huddled. Wrapped in a cocoon of light. Breathing. She opened her eyes. And the moment she did, everything stopped moving. Birds froze in flight. Wind halted mid-gust. Even sound vanished. Time itself hesitated. And then, slowly she stood. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Every apex child turned toward her. Silent, as if they had known about her all along. The guides stared in disbelief, realizing something none of them had dared consider. This child wasn't meant to be guided. She was meant to decide. Elian stepped forward. His voice gentle. You're the final question. She looked at him, then at the humans gathered behind him. Her gaze lingered on the old guide, the one who had given up everything to raise a child who wasn't his. Then she looked up at the sky. And she asked the question that no one expected. Do they still want to be better? The humans didn't answer right away. Because the truth was no one knew. We'd come so far. But was it far enough? One of the younger guides stepped forward. Voice shaking. We do. She tilted her head, studying him. Even if it hurts? Yes. Even if it means losing who you were? He swallowed. Especially then. She closed her eyes. The second ring responded. Not by opening. By vanishing. It folded in on itself, collapsing silently into a single glowing thread that drifted upward and disappeared into the sky like a lost thought. The child turned back to Elian and whispered, Then you're ready. And for the first time since the beginning, the sky opened again. Not one ring. Dozens. They stretched across the atmosphere like a constellation. Glowing. Waiting. The apex children began to rise, literally, into the air, weightless and calm. Their guide stared upward, unsure whether to feel proud or broken. But then something unexpected happened. They reached out. Each child extended a hand downward. Not to say goodbye, but to lift them up. The message was simple. This time we rise together. And the world rose. Cities lit up. Oceans shimmered. The scars of old wars faded beneath new lights. And in that moment, just before vanishing into the glow, Elian looked back. Not at the stars. But at the people who had taught him how to be kind. How to cry. How to hope. He smiled. And whispered one final truth. You weren't chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because even in your worst moments you still try. Then he was gone. And the stars were full again. The sky had never looked the same after that. Not because of the rings, they were gone now, folded into the fabric of whatever came next, but because of what people saw when they looked up. They didn't just see stars anymore. They saw a future. They saw memories. They saw proof that they were not alone, not forgotten, not small. They saw the place where their children had gone and maybe one day where they might go too. In the days that followed, the world slowed down. Not in fear or confusion this time, but in something closer to reflection. Governments paused meetings. Cities dimmed lights. Schools held quiet assemblies where students sat on floors, holding each other's hands, trying to understand what had changed and what hadn't. The guides came back different. Not glowing or godlike. Just quieter. Like people who had seen the ocean from the bottom and survived. Some spoke openly about it. Others stayed silent, carrying what they'd seen like old letters folded inside their chest. But all of them had the same look in their eyes, something between awe and ache. The girl, the final child, didn't leave. She stayed. No one knew why. No one dared ask at first. But she didn't speak again. Not with words. She just walked. Through cities, mountains, and even deserts. Not like she was lost, but like she was looking for something. And wherever she went, things changed. Not wildly. Not magically. Just enough. A village in the Andes suddenly grew green again, even in places where the soil had died. A forgotten part of the Sahara began to bloom with strange flowers that shimmered like they were remembering light from another world. And in places where wars had left ruins, people started rebuilding, not the same walls but something new. The severance movement dissolved in days. Not because they were forced to. Because they saw what happened when people weren't afraid anymore. They watched a city that once held the loudest protests turn their gathering square into a quiet sanctuary. No speeches. Just music. Just people sitting together, facing the horizon, remembering the names of the children who had taught them how to feel again. The question everyone asked now wasn't what were the apex really? Or what do they want from us? It was, what do we do now that we've been seen? One of the scientists who had spent years decoding the apex signals, an old man with tired eyes and shaking hands, wrote a single line in his notebook before retiring for good. It read, asterisk, they gave us the chance to stop surviving and start becoming. Asterisk. And that line started to spread. It showed up on murals etched into stone, whispered into microphones, shared between strangers who no longer felt the need to hide behind small talk. It became something more than a quote. It became the beginning of something new. The governments didn't collapse. They just changed. They stopped pretending they had the only answers. They started listening more. Letting the witness circles stay open to anyone, not just officials. And the circles grew. They started in big cities but soon they were everywhere. Around fire pits. In community gardens. On the backs of cargo ships drifting across oceans. People came together to share not what they had, but what they dreamed. And that, more than anything else, is what the apex left behind. Not technology. Not weapons. Not a new god. They left behind the courage to care louder than fear. The guides, those who still remained, began quietly training others. Not as replacements but as continuers. Anyone could join. No ranks. No uniforms. Just a willingness to hold space for what was difficult. To sit with pain. To help others feel seen. One of the youngest trainees, a girl who had once lived in an overcrowded housing block and never knew her father, became one of the most trusted guides within 3 years. Not because she knew everything, but because when people spoke to her they felt like she was really there. And that was the gift. Not ascension. Not power. Presence. That was what the apex had seen in humans. That even in their darkest moments they stayed, they fought for each other. They stumbled, yes. They hurt, yes. But they tried, again and again. Even when they had every reason to give up. And now, with the apex children gone, risen into something beyond, humans were left not with a burden but with a torch. To carry forward. To raise their own kind better. To hold each other more gently. To remember that humanity wasn't chosen because it was perfect, but because it learned. Not fast. Not easily. But honestly. Elian's guide, who never gave his real name to the world, was later seen living in a small house near the place where the sky had first opened. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write books. He just tended a garden and helped rebuild a nearby village school that had been abandoned during the years of fear. Sometimes, children from the new world, those who would grow up never knowing what it was like before the sky changed, came to visit. They didn't ask him about the past. They just liked being near him. As if something still glowed faintly from the time he had once held a piece of the future in his arms. One day the girl, the final child, came to visit him too. She was older now. Maybe 16, maybe more. Her eyes still held the same calm. She sat beside him on a wooden bench, watched the garden sway in the wind, and finally spoke her second sentence. I stayed because I wanted to see if you'd make it. He looked at her with a soft smile. And did we? She didn't answer right away. Just leaned back watching the clouds. Then she nodded once. You're not done. But you're walking. And that was enough. She left again after that, disappearing into the mountains. Some said she was still out there, walking the edges of the world, listening for signs of who we were becoming. Others believed she was already gone, folded into the sky like the others. But the truth didn't matter. Because by then the world had changed. Not all at once. Not perfectly. There were still arguments. Still old wounds. Still people who fell and needed help to rise again. But now someone was always there to help them up. And that was the story. Of how the apex species chose humans to raise their children. Not because we were strong. Not because we were smart. But because when things fall apart, we hold each other. Because when faced with something bigger than ourselves, we don't run. We reach. And maybe that's not the most efficient path. Maybe it's not the cleanest or the fastest or the safest. But it's ours. And it's enough to build a future on. So the next time someone asks if we were chosen by accident, if it was luck or fate or some hidden pattern in the stars, you can tell them this. We were chosen because we love through the chaos. Because even after all the noise, we still believe the most human thing is to keep going. To try again. To grow. And because even when the sky fell open and the stars poured out their truths, we didn't look away. We looked up. And we whispered back. We're here. And we're listening.